When immigrant families enter a clinic seeking therapy, the presentation is remarkably consistent. The room is defined by severe, visceral friction between first-generation parents and their adult or adolescent children. The children describe households suffocated by overbearing parental control and a lack of emotional support. The parents, meanwhile, describe a profound lack of respect and a complete breakdown of family connection. In the clinical literature, this friction tracks with a highly specific metric. As the child's rate of assimilation into the host culture increases, their perception of warmth in the household decreases. When a second-generation child rapidly adopts the symbols and identity of the host culture, it triggers a protective reflex in the parents, the fear of cultural erasure and the loss of family continuity. This graph maps the structural mismatch. We see a declining curve where, as the cultural distance widens on the x-axis, the perceived warmth on the y-axis drops sharply. Parents and children are operating on misaligned psychological axioms. Western developmental models prioritize individual autonomy and independence. Traditional East Asian models are built on harmonious interdependence, where the family functions as a single, inseparable entity rather than a collection of individuals. The resulting friction points to a deep misalignment between the family's competing cultural frameworks. To understand this collision, we must look at East Asian parenting, specifically Guan, or training. It requires intense, active parental involvement. Clinical psychology typically evaluates parenting through the Baumrind matrix, plotting parental control against responsiveness. Western standards labeled the high-warmth, high-autonomy quadrant as the optimal environment for child development. Guan operates on a different axis. It's characterized by continuous monitoring and constant guidance to ensure the child's academic and social success. Evaluating Guan through a Western 2x2 matrix creates a diagnostic error, dragging the data point into the authoritarian quadrant. But epidemiological data, like the Gutenberg Health Study, challenges this. Transitioning to a bar chart, we see a distinct pattern regarding mental health. In collectivistic cultures, high parental control is normative. Unlike in Western groups, this strict supervision does not correlate with increased depressiveness or adverse mental health outcomes in adolescence. Utilizing unmodified Western typologies produces false positives for pathological authoritarianism in immigrant families. This misclassification extends directly into the living room, specifically around the complaint of emotional coldness, frequently voiced by second-generation children. Western culture defines parental warmth through overt physical affection and direct verbal praise. Love is spoken, and love is shown. This split-screen model illustrates the divide. While Western warmth expresses love verbally, collectivistic warmth expresses it through intense devotion, cooking meals, funding education, and close behavioral monitoring. The parent transmits a clear signal of affection through daily sacrifices and strict oversight. But the child, socialized in the host culture, lacks the mechanism to decode it. The signal hits a cultural filter and is relabeled as overbearing control. By evaluating their parents through host culture metrics, the child interprets intense parental involvement as a violation of their autonomy. The parent's deepest expression of devotion becomes the child's primary source of resentment. This coldness represents a systemic translation error, where the family's emotional language remains unreadable across the generational divide. This translation error does not remain abstract. It manifests as daily household tension through a mechanism known as acculturative stress. This timeline graph tracks a family's trajectory after migration. The timelines diverge. The parent's line remains anchored to traditional values, while the child's line arcs sharply toward host culture norms. The parent's rigid adherence to their native culture acts as a defense mechanism, an attempt to maintain family continuity in a highly unfamiliar environment. Simultaneously, the child experiences an imperative to assimilate. This expanding space between their trajectories creates a friction zone, the structural location of acculturative stress. The observed household dysfunction tracks directly to this acculturation gap. When these families reach clinical care, the standard therapeutic reflex is to establish Western boundaries and enforce individual autonomy. This approach frequently backfires. Forcing individualistic autonomy onto an interdependent system signals to the parents that the therapist is actively undermining their authority. The result is almost always the premature termination of therapy. To treat these families effectively, Clinicians must adapt Western therapeutic frameworks for East Asian populations, relying on specific, culturally calibrated guidelines. One successful adaptation is the technique of shaping competency. Instead of pathologizing strictness, the therapist identifies and reinforces the highly beneficial aspects of the parent's traditional strategies. Returning to our communication model, the therapist steps in as a cultural translator. They reframe the parent's intense monitoring as guan, recoding the signal so the child can recognize the protective devotion driving the behavior. Clinical success relies entirely on validating the parent's traditional values, while equipping the child with the psychological tools to bridge the acculturation gap. Success requires evaluating family systems through their native structural physics, recognizing that health and harmony can exist outside the Western individualistic mold.